everyone, and welcome. I am James Milan, and this is Talk of the Town. We are having a legislative update, which we periodically do, and we're happy to welcome into our studio our State Senator Cindy Friedman, who, while she represents 4 other towns as well as Arlington, she lives right here in town, and so we like to call her our own. Cindy, always a pleasure to have you.
I feel the same way, James. Glad to be here.
Thanks, as always, for carving out time. We do know how much you race back and forth between here and the State House, so we appreciate it. So, as usual, we just want to talk over, what's been going on at the State House since we last spoke. But let me ask you just to situate us. Right now, we're speaking, it's mid-June. So tell us where we are in the legislative cycle for the year.
So we are about a quarter of the way through, maybe a little more because the second year is kind of funny in the last 3 months, but we're about a quarter of the way through the 2-year cycle, and we have just, the House has completed their budget and the Senate's completed theirs, and now we're in conference with those 2 budgets, which is taking a certain amount of time. It will determine things as we move forward, what's in it, what's not in it. So there's work around that. And then we have been working on other things. We passed a hands-free bill.
That's for texting in the car?
For texting in the car. We've had some other
phones, I guess, generally.
Yes, no handheld, no handheld devices. We are about to pass a bill that frames the Janus decision, which has to do with unions and paying union dues, and the Supreme Court had a ruling around who has to pay union dues and who doesn't, so the state has to now step in and refine what our rules are. We've brought up, we're working on a wage theft bill that is going to better protect people whose wages, who are not receiving wages for work that they've done. So we've been pretty busy, and we've done a couple supplemental budgets. And
I'm gonna interrupt you and just ask a little bit more about, you were mentioning where we are in the budget cycle. You've been through this a number of times already, and you were saying, it's taking a little while. You have to reconcile these things. Is this a typical year for that kind of thing? Not any more kind of either tension or fractiousness than normal, or not any less?
It's a less fractious time than other times, than some other times, because there's money, and we've reached our benchmark and we've gone beyond it. So that takes some of the pressure off in funding priorities and being able to fund more priorities than when we're in a very, very tight budget cycle. So it's sort of been a smoother, but you still have differences, and there's always a couple things at least where people are very clear about that's a line they don't want to cross. The House wants this, the Senate wants this, the Senate doesn't want this, the House doesn't want this, and so that's what you kind of spend your time reconciling those differences.
Yeah, I guess what you're describing is a situation in which it's better to be fighting, so to speak, over or trying to figure out how to spend more money than you thought you were going to have. That's better than trying to figure out what's going to get cut when you have too little money, but it's still it still ain't easy.
It still ain't easy. There's still many important programs and things that people care very much about, and we have more money, but we don't have enough money to fund everything and to bring programs up to where they were before 2007 and 2008 when we had such a serious recession. So,
yeah. Well, speaking about the fact that there is, more money than there has been sometimes in the past, though still never enough. Chapter 70 funding, which as we all know is education funding given by the state to towns and municipalities to support those goals. everybody's very well aware of what's just happened here in Arlington. We are signed on to build a new school, and also clearly the override that we also passed has a lot to do with school enrollment burgeoning in the way that it has over the last 10 years or more, and services needing to be provided, et cetera. So that's partly, we're paying that partly through the override as well. So I think people will be very interested to know whether there will or might be any more Chapter 70 money coming our way from the state. And I understand from conversations over the years that would require a change in the formula for how they figure that out. What's going on with that?
So you know that we had a Foundation Budget Review Commission that came out with a set of recommendations and a cost to what we would need to do to change the formula so that it meets a 21st century education. It's an extraordinary amount of money. It's in the billions to get us to that place where we're actually funding to the level that's needed for that kind of education. Last session, we worked at a compromise with the House on a foundation budget, kind of policy for how we would fund over time, and we didn't come to a consensus. So we have a new Senate chair of the Committee on Education, and he and the House chair, right out of the gate, started to sit down with the stakeholders that were holding a lot of stakes in this, and they've been working on, you know, if we can come to a compromise so that we meet the goals of education funding. The Senate put in significantly more money into the budget this year than the House did, and so while it's not enough, they did fund it at a higher level. And first, I think we're trying to address the issues around low-income students and English language learners, and but you know, some of the big things we haven't addressed, like I mean, healthcare costs are huge, take an enormous amount of money out of the budget, and transportation is another piece. So we have steps to go in order to fund it fully, but we're starting, and I think I know that's a very serious issue,
What you
and
said
people are
sounds
working
like
very
if
hard.
the head of the committee on the Senate side and on the House side right away are getting together, at least there's a prioritization of this.
Yeah, this is not waiting till the last hour. This is really something that I think everybody's committed to coming up with a solution.
Something else I was wondering about is that not since last we talked perhaps, but it's still relatively recent, I think, that you've ascended to number 2 position on the Ways and Means Committee. And I'm just wondering a couple of things. I'd love to just get a general sense of you know, how that feels for you, what kind of, I guess, added responsibilities might be entailed, but also just whether you feel like you're able to more effectively represent the interests of your district there. Just give us a sense of how that's going for you.
It's been fascinating for me. I've learned a lot. It's just the process itself and the amount of resources and energy and brain power it takes just to put it together and make sure all the pieces fit. And it's been really interesting to see the process firsthand, to be involved.
When you say put it together, what's the
budget,
you're talking
put
about?
a budget
right?
together to take, you know, this $43 billion chunko change, not all of which we get to spend. In fact, not very much of it do we get to spend on our priorities. So much of that money is already mandated and already
kind of allotted to something.
Yeah, allotted for something. And so that's been really interesting. I think the people that work on it, the Senate Ways and Means staff, is just amazing in their ability to keep all of this information and both do the financial and the policy side. So that's been really interesting. Yes, I do have, the part I worked on in terms of the budget were the pieces around healthcare and around, those areas that I know and feel like I can give some input into. So I focused on that: mental health, behavioral health, healthcare in general. So I feel like I was involved in those pieces, and that was great.
Is that kind of how things play out on such a committee? At least if it's functioning well, is that
this
you
is
would...
how our chairman does it. Okay, so when when we sat down together, and I said, what can I do? I could take pieces of this and kind of be the eyes and the sounding board and whatever for those pieces, and he said that would be great. So I got to do that, and he was very inclusive of me in that process. A lot of negotiations go back and forth between the two chairs, and so I feel like for the pieces that I know, and I feel like I can, that I have actually something valuable to add to it. I am kept in the loop of that, and he again, because we have a great chair, and that's how he wants to do it. So it's really up to who's there.
And what is the difference? I'm just going to assume that folks out there are as curious as I am about this, but I am anyway. What is the difference between being the number 2 person and being on the committee? Like, what stuff do you need to do, or do you get to do, or what kinds of responsibilities are added in as that person?
Well, in the Senate, and I can only speak for the Senate, it really is, it's really centralized around the chair.
Okay.
And partly that's so because it's very, very complicated, and it takes an enormous amount of people, staff, analysts, and policy people that don't move around. They stay there, so whoever the chair is comes in to this group of people whose job it is to work on this budget. So it's not, while we would really like, while we think everybody should have a say and everybody, it's so complicated. It's kind of like the Arlington budget, right? You have the finance committee, and that is a group of people who are dedicated to looking at that budget. And they have, you've got people in the finance committee who look at education and transportation and capital and public safety, and that's what they do. And they learn, they gain expertise, they understand the budget. When I, as a town meeting member, get to town meeting and I'm handed the budget, there is so much that I don't know that it makes it hard for me to be to really participate in a way that I think would be
feels
useful.
Well informed,
yeah.
right?
And I don't think it's that members aren't that they don't want to be, but it takes so much.
Right. So you have
time and energy.
Right. So you have folks like the finance committee, and I'm sure in town, and then I'm sure there are plenty of the staff at the State House,
right.
Who are basically doing all that work
all the time,
on our behalf,
yes,
basically,
on our behalf, right.
And then presenting their conclusions. And again, the good thing that I hear you saying is that just as we, I think, in town in general, have a high degree of trust.
You have to trust the people
in
exactly.
the work of the finance committee. You're saying same thing is true.
Now, as the vice chair, I sat down over several times and went through all the line items with the staff, and I have a much better understanding of why things happened the way they did. But I'm going to be really honest with you. If it was in an area that I didn't know about, I had nothing to say. We got to the Health and Human Service and the mental health and behavioral health and healthcare, then I could say, okay, because I know this line item, I know these programs, I know what people are trying to do, then I felt like I could be useful. But that was one little piece of it, And so I early on, when I sat down with the chair, said, here's where I think I can help on this, and I can certainly be a pair of eyes or whatever, but here's where I think I understand enough that I could add some value. And so that's how I've worked with the chairman, and he's been, unbelievably wonderful and inclusive and open, and is very straight with me. He tells me what's going on, and he knows the things I really care about, and he knows and he knows what my local priorities are.
Right. Well, for what it's worth, it seems to me that you're doing a better service both to the committee and to your constituents by concentrating on weighing in on the stuff that you know best.
Right.
It's not just that you're most interested in it, but you know it best. So therefore, and not trying to do that with stuff you don't know.
With stuff I don't know, and
Yeah, that seems like a good idea.
And you brought up a really good point. I have enormous trust and faith in the people on the Senate side that do this. I think I know what the priorities of the Senate are. I know what the priorities of the Senate president are. I know that those are that when people do this work, the staff and the chairman do this work, they do that with those priorities in mind. And I have enormous amount of trust and respect for them. So I think it works out. And it's, I don't always get what I want, and everybody doesn't always get what they want, and sometimes you do. And but it all seems to come out of a very honest, good place.
So let me ask you about a couple of things specifically, and then I'm going to ask you a couple more open-ended questions, as we usually do, just to get a sense of what's, what the highlights are and what the roadblocks are. But specifically, I think, and this is something that we have talked about in just about every conversation we've had, but it feels like things are a little bit further along. There's a little bit more data and maybe a little more revenue now. So just wondering about changes to gaming in the state gaming being legalized, and then also marijuana, not just the legalization, but now there are dispensaries open, and there are also just recreational pot shops open. The revenue's starting to come in, I assume. Without asking you, what for very specific allocations of those funds, is that the case? Is that money starting to come in, and is it targeted for particular purposes?
Yes. So yes, the money is starting to come in. The budget assumes a certain amount of money coming in from gaming or from marijuana in this next, for this next year. It's somewhat conservative because it needs to be. And yes, there are, when we legalized gaming, part of what we did in that statute was set up certain funds and allocate certain money to go to certain places as that money came in. And so that will start to happen. And a lot of those are community-based services or behavioral health or things that are somewhat associated to gaming, community support, public safety, that kind of thing. So those were in place, and that's what so that's starting to happen. And that happened a little bit before because a lot of money came from licensing. So even before we built them, they had to get licenses. And so we started to see that money a while ago. And the same on the marijuana side. We have a certain amount of that tax money that's coming in from marijuana is allocated to mostly public health and health care related funds.
Well, as you and I were discussing before we went on camera, and I'll bet it'll come up again later in our conversation, there is still a need for more revenue all the time in the state in order to fund priorities.
Nothing's getting cheaper.
Right. So let me ask you about another potential source that people would probably have heard about on the airwaves, even though I think it's a ways away, and that is where do the things stand on what's called fair share amendment, or there are other terms for it, but you can describe first of all what it is, and secondly where we're at with that.
So the Fair Share Amendment was an initiative that was started by advocates, and it was last session it began, and it was a ballot question to allow the state to tax personal income over $1 million at a higher rate than personal income below $1 million, and it was an additional 4% tax.
So that's $1 million per year in a given year. It's $1 million of income
in a given year,
in
and
a
it's a 4% tax on what's above that. they had got the signatures, it was going to be on the ballot. Somebody took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled the ballot, the wording of the ballot, void because it had, what this money is going to is education and transportation. And because of the way it was written, the Supreme Court said that you can't, you can't have these two things in the same ballot. Mm-hmm. There were other things, but basically, you're not a ballot initiative can only do one thing. And there was some question about whether that was happening or not. You also can't tie the hands of any future legislature when it comes to financial, to budgets and appropriations.
So I know that it was a kind of generally disappointing decision by the Supreme Judicial Court at that time, because there was real momentum behind this. But sounds like the reasoning solid enough.
And the Supreme Court said what the Supreme Court said, and you have to, and I know this was something people were worried about as well. So what happened this session was the advocates asked a senator and a rep to file a bill. So that's another way we can change the Constitution. We can change it through a ballot initiative, we can change it through legislative process, but they both end up by having the voters of the state vote on that change. It's just the process of getting to that. So when you do it through the legislature, you have to go through this process where you have what they call constitutional conventions. And that is when both both branches come together and they vote on the proposal, and they vote to either move it or they vote to not move it. Mm-hmm. And that's how we did equal marriage. Mm-hmm. And so we just did the second Constitutional Convention, and next year we have to do another two, and then it will be ready in the following years to go on the ballot. So we are now.
And I understand that it passed quite strongly.
Quite strongly. We had the vote was last week, and it passed around 140 to 40 something. So it was quite a spread. There's a lot of support for it in the
So probably people can anticipate that even though the process itself is going to take a while to play out because that's just the way that it is, this is the way that we're headed. And
this is how we're headed to get to the ballot,
right,
so that everybody can vote on it.
Right. It is likely to, assuming again nothing crazy happens, it's likely to get on the ballot. Yeah. I think it's 2022 maybe, or something like that. Yeah. It's still a ways away, but it is, again, all signs point in that direction. Obviously, that will bring in some additional revenue.
Yeah, conservatively, they're talking about another $2 billion, which is a lot of money for education and transportation.
But we can't spend any of that yet.
Can't spend any of it yet.
Yeah. So about that, as I said, we had mentioned the need for more revenue in general. You're happy to, or I'm happy to have you speak about either the need for more revenue and possible ideas for how to generate that, or you can do it through simply talking about like highlights, things that have gone well or are going well, and roadblocks. However you want to, I would like you to address all those. So let me be less confusing and say, on the revenue question, are there ideas that we haven't heard about? Is there any reason to be optimistic that either sources of revenue will provide more, or in general that we are going to get a better fit between what our needs are for services, goods and services, and where to get the money from?
The governor, in his budget that he gave to the legislature, had some tax increases. And they were taxes on things like pharmaceuticals, taxes on transfer taxes. So there were a set of things that he actually offered in his budget, and that went to specific things. So there's clearly, and the Senate, while we while we didn't do all of them, we did one of them. We did an opioid tax, a tax on pharmaceutical companies that, or pharmaceuticals that are opioid related. Mm-hmm. So we had a tax, and that tax would have raised $10 million, and we figured out how we could spend that $10 million in ways that we felt were very analogous to
right,
it, or,
right,
useful
relevant
to addressing that issue. So there also, the Senate has a revenue task force that they started that is also been meeting quite a bit to talk about, besides the Fair Share Amendment, how do we get a more balanced revenue system so that we bring in revenue so that we don't put it on the backs of those who can least afford it, so that it's more progressive. Mm-hmm. So our tax structure right now is very regressive. Everybody pays the same flat rate, and that's by constitution. And so we're looking at ways to how we can address that. Are there ways without changing the Constitution that we can make a fairer system? Mm-hmm. We have a lot of tax expenditures that we call them, which are basically tax breaks. We have tax breaks for things like airplane fuel and private jets. We have tax breaks in these hidden little buckets. And so there is an effort to look at those and bring them to light and evaluate them. Is this what we want to be doing with, do we want to give tax breaks to these things? Are they important enough to the economic security and growth of the Commonwealth? And we need to look at them. And there's quite a few of them. Last time I looked, there were over 400. Okay,
so when you say there's quite a few of them, and then a number like over 400 is, that's an ear-catching number. Does that mean that if you can both look at those, reevaluate them, and perhaps eliminate them, that would add up to some real money?
It could, depending on what, I would argue that what we gave GE for tax breaks added up to some real money.
Right. And, but we can't take that back, right?
Well, we can't take it back, but also some of it won't come to fruition because some of them were based on, them meeting certain requirements. So, but I don't know, but I think it's hard to believe. One of the things that we always are debating is the film tax credit. And that's a very contentious.
That's intended to encourage
filming and that kind of art to come to Massachusetts. And some people will point to it and say for every 70 cents we bring in, we pay $1, and other people will say, look at this burgeoning industry that we have now because we had those tax credits. So now if we didn't have that tax credit, and the same amount of people came to the state, it would bring in a lot of money.
Right.
The question then is, when you take it away, what happens? Does it go away? So it's more nuanced, but it needs to be looked at. And I'm sure there are things in there that, and what's real money? $50 million, $100 million? That's real money. That will fund some programs I'll give some good funding to programs. It'll add more money to the special ed circuit breaker, or local aid, or so yeah.
One issue of great consternation for all that it probably won't do much to help is the state of the MBTA. And again, I know that we cover the same topics over and over again, but hey, it's part of many people's daily lives. And there is, at the moment, because we are suffering a red line outage that seems to be going on and on and on, and that's me talking, and I don't even have to travel that way. But it's as topical as ever, basically, what to do with the MBTA. Yep. So your thoughts on that?
I would very much like to see a greater sense of urgency from our administration. I understand that when you ignore something for as many years as we've ignored the MBTA, that every year you ignore it, it gets worse and worse, and the time you need to fix it gets longer and longer. So I do not pretend for a minute that we can give the MBTA, $100 million more, and all of a sudden our trains are going to run. And so much of what we're dealing with here has to do with infrastructure and just poor maintenance, and not even poor maintenance. I don't even want to say poor maintenance. Those cars are not meant to run for 55 years. Those tracks are not, those signals are old. The system is old. And this is what happens when you don't have leadership over many years. And I will say that our last governor tried very hard to get more money into the system. This is what happens. So whatever we do is not going to bring us immediate relief. Having said that, we need to do it, because it will only get worse. And so that's what's really frustrating to me. I understand that, you can't fix it. But if we had more money, we could extend the MBTA, we could extend buses, we could extend, we could support our RTAs, we could mix up our regional transportation, we could, better connect regional with our MBTA system. We could put more money into the commuter rail. We could fix our roads and our bridges. We could bring things up to a state of good repair. So,
but how much does the governor, like you're saying that there needs to be stronger leadership around here and a greater sense of urgency coming from the governor's office. How much?
Well, when the governor says we don't need more money for the MBTA, we don't need money, we don't need to. We should do a study on our transportation system and how our traffic is we should do a study on traffic. Does he go outside? That kind of thing does not show a kind of a sense of urgency. He hasn't said, okay, I am willing to sit down and listen to come up with a immediate, a medium, and a long-term plan. How do we do this? What do we need to do? So that's what I mean. We're dying for more Chapter 90 money, just to keep our roads and bridges up to par. We could use more revenue for that. Mm-hmm. Our cities and towns would be thrilled, because it falls on them, to keep those things going, and to keep our transportation system safe, which includes the MBTA, buses, cars, roads, bridges. So I find that that's what so much of the frustration is. It's just frustrating day to day. And I was for a long time a red line user, and I try and go to the red line, take the train in as much as I can. I cannot get to Alewife. Just forget it. I cannot get there. Mm-hmm. And nor can I get out of it if I come home around between 4 and 6 o'clock.
Right. Not in any reasonable amount of time.
Not in any reasonable amount of time.
Yeah.
And so people like me say, what do I do? Plus, we raise the rates, we raise the parking fees, which I spoke out very strongly against to the MBTA board, especially when you have a parking lot that's falling down. So it just pushes more and more people onto the roads, because they got to get to work. And at some point, it costs so much money, they might as well park.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, it does sound, we're going to have to leave this because we need to begin to close things down here, and I want to just ask you about one or two other things. But I will say it doesn't sound encouraging, because it sounds to me like political arsenic, basically, that you're talking about somebody needing to lead us in a way that says we need to start the pain now, and the gain is right, a long ways away. So let's hope. Right.
But in the short term, we evidently have a lot of cars that are in Springfield that have been built for the lines. This Chinese company. Where are they? So.
All right. A good question. All right. Let me ask you, just to wrap up, Cindy, briefly to let us know of anything that we have not mentioned, or that you just wanted to highlight, and specifically, that is either an accomplishment, an achievement from this past term, or something you're looking forward to, as well as any kind of challenges or roadblocks or frustrations you might want to share.
So the term's been 6 months, and I think a lot of things have happened, and I'll be totally honest, I can't remember. We are so in the moment. There is so much going on, and I feel like we're doing so much that
Right, it's very
I can't remember, right? But I will say that that a lot of my effort and energy is going into healthcare right now, and to the end of making healthcare more accessible, affordable, and higher quality. And
do you have optimism around that, or?
I have some optimism. I think it's really important that so many people, so many of my constituents and so many people across the Commonwealth are saying, we can't do this anymore. We can't afford this. And that pressure is really helpful to getting us to sit down and figure out how do we make this less expensive. And it really does mean that all the stakeholders have to be there, and all the stakeholders have to give skin in the game. Unless people watching this think I am a socialist, I will tell you that so much of our healthcare, many of our healthcare entities make huge, huge, huge amounts of dollars. Some of our hospitals, some of our pharmacy benefit manager companies, our providers, our pharmaceutical companies, that we can lower costs and people can make a good amount of money and good revenue. Both of those things can happen at the same time. And for anybody to tell you differently, there is so much money in that system, and we need to look at how we're spending it and where it's going, and is it making the health of our residents better? And all the indicators right now tell us it's not. And we have to fix that. And people have to just, we have to put the pressure on to say, no, you need to come to the table and you need to put skin in the game. You will be fine. We need to take care of our residents. Mm-hmm. So and I am hopeful. And even if I'm frustrated, but it's such a fight worth fighting that, I don't see any of us giving up right now in the short term. So.
Right, and again, it's one with long-term payoff.
It's very, very complicated, and it's a long-term.
Yeah. Kind of just in general, it's a long-term challenge, as well as the payoff being still a little ways away. A little ways away, yeah. And you did mention that maybe that kind of covers both things, because you said you are both hopeful and optimistic, and also frustrated. So maybe that is both a highlight and a roadblock.
Oh yeah, it's all frustrating. Yeah. Some of it's just just because you want to get it done, and some of it is people put up crazy roadblocks, and you have to deal with it because that's democracy.
Messy it is, but it's our mess.
It's our mess, right?
Yeah. Anything else that you just wanted to share with folks? Again, I'm not asking you to tax your memory or anything like that, but just anything that you might leave saying, darn it, I forgot to.
I'm really impressed with how Arlington came out for the override and the debt exclusion. I know that there are people who chose to take on more burden for the good of our students and for the good of our town. And I think that that's really says a lot about where we live, and I'm very proud of that. And I know that the town is committed to helping those people who are going to find themselves in a position where this is really going to make or break their ability to live here. And so, so I feel really great about the statement that we've made, and I feel good that we're going to continue to work to ensure that people who live in Arlington can stay in Arlington, because it's a great town, and having diversity is really important, and having people with different viewpoints and different economic levels. It all makes our town richer. So I want to be sure that we keep that, and that everybody feels like they belong here. So.
I'm very glad that you brought that up, because of course it's been such a huge concern here in town. We at ACMi have really been steeped in this for a while now, and especially the last thing that you mentioned there, the fact that there are a bunch of folks in town who are going to need if they're going to stay here, they're going to need the rest of us, frankly, to offer something.
Right.
And so perhaps a conversation to continue
Yep.
with you as
Absolutely.
things move forward from here.
And we're going to have to fix our revenue system so that we don't depend so much on the regressive property tax, and we move toward a more progressive income tax. And
Challenges abound.
and I just want to be clear, I hate paying taxes, okay? Do not enjoy it. We don't enjoy writing those checks. We cringe every time we have to, so just, I will leave with
She's
that.
not a socialist, but she doesn't love
I don't
paying
like taxes.
Let's make that clear.
But
all right. Well, again, as always, we thank you very much. And we've covered a lot of ground. We probably forgot a bunch of things. But fortunately, we'll have you back.
You know where I live.
All right.
Well, thank you. It's always great to talk with you.
Thanks again. For our state senator, Cindy Friedman, I'm James Millan. Thanks for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. We'll see you next time.